Hi guys, welcome back to History with Heath, and today we're going to be looking at the Arians and Semi-Arians, the best Christian heretics. And I would just like to say, I haven't been posting for a very long time now, but I am back. I've been a bit sick recently, just a lot of things that I've got in my way of making a video. But now I'm making a video on the Semi-Arians and the Arians. Anyway, so let's get straight into it. So, as most of you know, the 4th century was one of the most turbulent periods in the history of Christianity, and there were so many debates over the nature of Christ, his relation to the Father, his divinity, his eternity. They shaped the councils, they split the churches, and they influenced the imperial politics of the Roman Empire. And among the most significant movements were Arianism and Semi-Arianism, which were two theological theories and positions that opposed the main Nicene Creed, but they also opposed each other. Like, yes, the Semi-Arians split off from the Arians, but they were still, enemies. Well, because the Semi-Arians split off from the Arians, yes, but that was because they disagreed with the Arians. They agreed with some parts, but not all of them. So, the origins of the controversy begins with Arius, who was a priest in Alexandria around 318 to 320 AD. And Arius argued that the Son was not eternal, but was a created being from the Father, and he was exalted above all creation, but he was not equal to the Father. He was one tier down. And his slogan was, "There was when he was not," which ignited this massive theological firestorm. One of the most famous Christian councils was the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which condemned Arius and declared that the Son was homoousios, which was of the same essence as the Father. So this is the basis of the Trinity. But the Nicene formula was, of course, not universally accepted, because, of course, Christianity was still growing at the time. Yes, it was becoming quite large, but it was still in these early stages in Europe. And many of these bishops were uncomfortable with the term homoousios, which they, of course, associate with modalistic monarchianism and Sabellianism. And if you don't really know, Sabellianism, also known as modalistic monarchianism, is a Christian belief that rejects the Trinity and says that the three persons of the Trinity are not emanations, but forms of God. Because with an emanation, it's when God imparts some of his divine essence. So the emanation of God is God, but not equal to God. But modalistic monarchians say that these are just different roles God pretends to be. Sometimes he acts as the creator, the Father, sometimes as the Son, Jesus, and sometimes as the Holy Spirit. And of course, many of these bishops agreed with what Arius said, and they were just they were like, this idea of the Trinity is basically just Sabellianism wrapped in a nice little package, and this massive discomfort gave rise to many alternative Christologies, but most prominent were Arianism and Semi-Arianism. So, Arianism is often simply misunderstood as just saying Christ is not divine, but it was actually more nuanced than that. It wasn't just saying Jesus is just a human. It was not that. That was very different. And Arius taught that the Father is alone, eternal, unbegotten, and truly God. So strict monotheism. And the Son was created out of nothing before the world. So the Son is the first creation of God, and the Son is the highest of all creatures, but he's still a creature. He's still below the Father. And they say that the Son's divinity is they believe that the Son could be called God in a secondary or honorific sense. And they say he's divine by grace, but not by nature. And they say that they worship him because the Father commands it, not because he shares the Father's essence. And you might be saying, well, this is polytheism. Well, the Arians said, well, yeah, it's kind of polytheism, but God the Father commanded it, so we're following God. That's what they said. And they were very and although they were kind of polytheist, they were also monotheists in that they said that they did worship Jesus, but they said that but they basically said that they were worshipping Jesus, but they weren't worshipping him as a god. They were worshipping him, but they didn't see him as a god. They saw him as not. They didn't see him as. They saw him as a different substance, God, a creation. And although they, like I said, although they do seem kind of polytheists, this Arianism came out of radical monotheism, the absolute unity of God and the uniqueness of the Father. And they say that if the Son is equal to the Father, then Christianity just becomes polytheistic or modalistic. And if the Son shares the Father's essence, then they're basically just two eternal beings, two gods, which is argued today. I know. Well, Arianism does kind of exist today, but not in the proper Arian form. But out of the Neo-Arians, most of them will use this argument that the Trinity is saying that there's three gods, and that's just a bit stupid. But then there's Semi-Arianism, which is also called Homoousianism, and which emerged as sort of a middle position between Arianism and the Nicene Orthodoxy. And unlike the Arians, the Semi-Arians said that the Son is not created, and the Son is eternally begotten from the Father, and they said that the Son is truly divine, not a creature. But they use the word homeosis, which is Greek for of similar essence. And what they meant by this is that they disagreed with the Nicene Christians. That they said that Christ is not the same essence as the Father, but he is also not just a creature, the same essence as people and all other creation. So they denied that, and they said that the Son is divine because he comes from the Father's essence, but he is not identical in the essence, which preserves a hierarchy. And they believe that the Father alone is the source of divinity, and that the Son receives his divinity from a Father, and this preserves the monotheism without denying the Son's divinity. And basically, they saw the Son as an emanation of the Father. And like I mentioned earlier, there's a difference between the term emanation, form, and manifestation. You might use them, some people use them interchangeably, but don't do that. They're very different things. An emanation is when a God transforms into a different form. And that emanation is that God, but he's not the same. Like, it's hard to explain, but it's kind of like if you get a big tank of water and you pour a tiny bit into a glass. Like, the water in there is the same water as in the big tank, but it's still separate. So that's kind of what emanation is. Then there's a manifestation, which is not really related, but I will explain it anyway. And a manifestation is when a god manifests you. And it might manifest as a human, an animal, or a thing, but this is directly that god. This isn't like something that flows from that God. Like, this isn't an emanation. This is directly that God appearing to you. Although he may look different, or he or she may look different, that is still them in their true form. And then there's form. And form means a lot of things. But when I'm talking about form now, when I say form, I mean that it's like a mask. It's similar to manifestation in that it's not an emanation. It's not a manifestation either, in that this God appears into a different form. And yes, some manifestations can be considered forms. So form is more of a kind, like a type of manifestation. But a form is when the God takes on almost different masks and pretends to be different beings. But this is not different emanations, of course. And of course, the modalistic monarchians, they don't believe the three persons are the emanations. They believe that they are just different modes almost. And the Semi-Arians believe that the Arians had kind of gone too far in denying that Christ was divine, but they believe that the Nicenes had gone too far, so they just said they were a middle way. And the relationship between the Arians and the Semi-Arians was very complex. They did get along in that they both rejected the Nicene theology, but of course the Semi-Arians saw Arians as too extreme, and the Arians saw the Semi-Arians as almost too Nicene and kind of drifting over. But the things that they agreed on, like I said, is that they both rejected the Nicene term of homeosis, and they both opposed Anastasius and that Nicene party, the main party, and they both wanted to avoid modalistic monarchianism. And the councils where they fought each other, well, when I say fought each other, I mean the Semi-Arians versus the Arians, was the Council of Sumerium in 351 to 357, where the Arians pushed the unlike essence doctrine, while the Semi-Arians resisted. Then there was the Council of Ankara in 358, where the Semi-Arians condemned Arianism just outright plainly. Then there was Seleucia in 359, where the two groups split and they just refused to sign each other's creeds. And the cooperation was pretty fragile and just collapsed into conflict. Even for the majority of Roman history, most Roman emperors were followers of Nicene Christianity. But there were actually two emperors, I believe 2 or 3 emperors, who were actually semi-Arian. One of them was Constantius II, who ruled from 337 to 361, and he gave, although he was semi-Arian himself, he also gave lots of positions to just plain Arian bishops, and many Nicene bishops were exiled. And at this point, Semi-Arianism had also almost become the default Christianity. Nicene Christianity had become the heresy. The roles had switched. And then after Constantinus, Emperor Julian came in, and of course Julian was a Nicene, so he allowed the bishops to return, and both Arianism and Semi-Arianism both became heresies again. And then Emperor Valens supported Semi-Arianism, but only in the East. That he was an emperor of the East, but he didn't do it strongly enough to unify the factions. So Valens was a Semi-Arian, but he didn't do what Constantinus II had. He didn't do what Constantinus had done. He didn't turn Nicene into a heresy. He was almost just a heretical person himself, a heretic himself. And Valens was the last Semi-Arian emperor, and after that, it died out. But there's one unite. But now let's move on to the decline of Arianism and Semi-Arianism. And around the 360s to the 370s, many Semi-Arians had actually realised that their theology was actually closer to Nicene Christianity than Arianism, although they had an Arian in their name. And they and the Cappadocian Fathers, who were all Nicene Christians, Basil, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzen, actually helped articulate a version of Nicene theology that addressed Semi-Arian concerns, and this led many Semi-Arians to become Nicenes. And then then we have Arianism itself, which just gradually collapsed because it denied Christ's true divinity, which many Christians just outright rejected. It fractured into many little subgroups like the Anomeans and the Eunomians, and it just lacked lots of theological depth compared to Nicene thought. And by the end of the 4th century, Arianism mainly survived just among the Gothic and Germanic tribes, and not properly within the Roman Empire. Because one thing to note definitely is that Arianism was quite popular in the Roman Empire, but it's also even more popular with many Germanic tribes, like especially the Lollards. The Lollards who ruled in Italy were the last Arian kingdom to ever, the last ones to exist. And despite dying out, Arianism influenced Gothic Christianity, even some Islamic interpretation of Jesus, and even later Unitarian movements indirectly. And that's what I said about Arianism just kind of exists, but not as Arianism. It's just kind of a neo-Arianism. But Arianism never really regained any Christian acceptance. But Semi-Arian's legacy is more subtle. It forced. One thing to note is that it did force Nicene theologians to actually write like loads of things. They actually had to refine their doctrine of the Trinity to allow Semi-Arian concerns. Because lots of these Nicene bishops were actually like, hang on, Nicene Christianity is actually kind of wrong. Like, not fully wrong, but kind of wrong. And the Semi-Arians actually have a big point. So I think we need to rewrite this kind of. And it kind of contributed to the development of the idea of one essence in 3 persons. And many of these Semi-Arian bishops actually became Nicene Christians and actually defended the Nicene orthodoxy. And of course, Semi-Arianism kind of acted as a bridge between Arians and Nicenes. And although there's no proper record of this, there is a good chance that there were many Arians who eventually became Semi-Arians, and then when Nicene Christianity went back over their idea, when they refined their concept of the Trinity, many Semi-Arians became Nicene. So it's like a Arian to Semi-Arian to Nicene. Anyway, the conclusion we have is that the Arians and the Semi-Arians just show how Christianity could have ended up a lot different. Like if Constantine the First had become an Arian or a Semi-Arian, then loads of things could be different. that there might not even be any proper Catholic church. It might just be an Arian church or a Semi-Arian church. It's just kind of crazy, you know. Anyway, thank you for listening. I'll catch you on the next one. But I'll definitely release a video next week. Definitely, 100%. Goodbye.